This man is not your typical physician. He is capable of performing exceedingly challenging surgery that no other physician can. A very serious rupture of an abdominal artery occurred in a patient today. He would be dead in a matter of minutes if he didn't have surgery. Unexpectedly, because all of the surgeons were busy, they refused to admit this guy when they brought him to the hospital. The doctor ruthlessly pushed the patient's relatives away despite their tears and misery. Young Min is a medical intern. He bravely underwent this procedure since he could not stand this scene. Dr. Cha, however, continued to push them away, claiming that Young Min was an intern and that he had no surgical training. Young Min immediately blocked it by clinging to the hospital bed. Indeed, the devil assumes the throne when the gods are overly preoccupied. Something suddenly entered Young Min's body, causing his eyes to light up. Young Min, a trainee physician, should not have been able to undertake this highly difficult surgery, but it was accomplished successfully. Young Min's career has since taken off like a kite in the wind. Since only he is capable of doing extremely complex procedures, Young Min is known as a professor. However, due to his exceptional surgical skills, Young Min also conceitedly establishes his own guidelines, saving only those with a 1% or less chance of survival. When he experiences cardiac arrest, he declines medical intervention. Young Min refused to accept the death of another patient today. He appeared to have foreseen which patients would pass away. Young Min is even more conceited and believes he is the best because he completed many of the most challenging surgery at the hospital. But when Suk, a recently arrived intern and the hospital president's nephew, showed there, it was a game changer. Young Min's personality is completely different from Suk's. Bodyguards accompany him to work so they can carry his belongings. Young Min had resentment toward him from the very first day because of this. Young Min inquired more and discovered that Suk's grandpa served as the hospital president, indicating that Suk would undoubtedly inherit the hospital. Young Min hated Suk even more after hearing this. Unexpectedly, the director personally asked Young Min to teach Suk after he went to inform the dean that he would not accept this in turn. Young Min went straight to Suk to discipline him. Surprisingly, Suk answered all of his questions properly, even the most challenging ones in medicine. Young Min began making Suk observe him perform surgery after noticing that he was unconcerned with theoretical inquiries. A patient required heart surgery for the 5th time today, but even the department head was afraid to do it because of the high risks. Only Young Min was capable of doing such a procedure in the entire nation. Young Min begged Suk to help him directly. Any surgery that Young Min does will be successful since he always warms up his hands before doing challenging procedures. The procedure was successful after 2 hours. But Suk froze, his limbs shaking, when Young Min requested him to take out the drainage tube. Young Min purposefully embarrassed Suk in front of the other trainees after learning that Suk was extremely terrified of doing surgery. He inquired as to whether a patient in dire need would prefer a tough physician like him, or someone like Suk who merely talks but lacks tact. Suk was embarrassed, but he dared not speak since he knew it was the truth. After that, he was taken to the emergency department to be on duty. Suk felt worthless here. He had trouble even doing basic things like drawing blood from patients. He was also punched by patients when he was greeting them. In the meantime, a wealthy tycoon's son asked Young Min to operate on his father's heart. Young Min stated that the chairman had too many underlying illnesses, but he would pay any price. He would die suddenly if they tried surgery. Therefore, the son pushed that Young Min do it. However, Young Min's true goal was to have his father have surgery and then pass away so he could inherit the family's wealth. Jin Soo took Young Min to see the chairman's father. Young Min became aware that this was the father of his former lover all of a sudden, and Se-jin, his former sweetheart, also showed up. In addition, she was a doctor who had studied in the United States. Since she had previously ended their relationship because of his lack of money, Young Min still detested seeing his ex-lover. Being a physician, Se-jin was well aware that her father was unable to have heart surgery. Young Min was aware of this as well, yet he still wanted to demonstrate his growing expertise to her. She would regret abandoning him if a doctor like her, who educated overseas, didn't have the courage to perform the procedure. Young Min returned to his room right away to get ready. The chairman's heart operation soon started. Young Min had to race against death due to his several underlying medical issues. Even though he was aware that the operation might not work, he was nevertheless committed to proving himself to his former lover. He shouted all the time to keep himself from dozing off. The surgery was successful 10 hours later. However, a dark scheme was executed as they waited for the chairman to awaken. Young Min was unaware that Tae-hyun was among those who wished to harm the chairman, but he and his colleague, Dr. Tae-hyun, kept vigil at the chairman's bedside. Unexpectedly, Young Min's ex-lover texted him to ask to meet up. He instructed Tae-hyun to watch the chairman while he went to meet Se-jin because he had no suspicions. Tae-hyun remained and executed the plan right away. When Young Min got to the meeting spot, Se-jin was not there. Young Min hurried back to the hospital after learning from his colleagues that the chairman was in severe condition while he was confused. Meanwhile, a delivery man was recruited to get Young Min into an accident. The delivery man saw him waiting at a red light and came after him. Unbeknownst to Young Min, the delivery man abruptly obstructed the automobile ahead, forcing Young Min to dodge and suffer a catastrophic injury. When Young Min awoke, she attempted to exit the vehicle. Nearby, the individual who struck him with the motorcycle was also unconscious. Young Min ran his hand through his arm to check his own pulse. His hand also went through his chest when he attempted to administer first aid. He was shocked to discover that his soul had departed his body. His soul started to wane as his body weakened. On the route to the hospital, Young Min had to sit in the ambulance with his body. Young Min observed as his co-workers hurried to administer first aid to him, knowing how to save himself while they were at a loss for what to do. Suk, the trainee, was the sole person on duty. Luckily, Suk knew enough about theory to identify the problem. Suk warned that Young Min would die unless he had immediate surgery, but the hospital that day did not have any surgeons available. Suk had a scalpel in his hand, but he was reluctant to use it because Young Min's life was in jeopardy and his blood pressure had fallen. In an attempt to do surgery, Young Min's soul reached for the scalpel, but he was unable. He stared helplessly as Suk finally picked up the scalpel, risking everything. Fearing that Suk was retaliating against him, Young Min yelled. When Suk positioned the knife, he was breathless and trembling. Suk's hand was suddenly taken by Young Min's soul, which caused Young Min's soul to enter Suk's body. Young Min took hold of Suk right away. Young Min started the surgery expertly and with his typical accuracy. Young Min performed the challenging task of delicately suturing the tear in Suk's own heart through his body. Young Min's soul returned to his body after the successful surgery regulated his blood pressure. Unaware of what had transpired, Suk awoke, but Young Min's blood pressure plummeted precipitously, leading his soul to depart his body once more. However, his soul was unable to re-enter Suk's body due to his weakness. Since the other surgeons were all preoccupied with the chairman's emergency, Suk was at a loss on what to do. Young Min felt as though he was about to die, and his soul fell apart. Tae-hyun came back at this crucial time and promptly operated on the ruptured left ventricle. Although the surgery was finished fast, Tae-hyun purposefully performed a treatment that left Young Min in a profound coma with no guarantee of when he would awaken. Young Min was incredibly perplexed and made every effort to reintegrate his soul into his body, but he was unsuccessful. That was not how he wanted to pass away. Since Suk had mimicked Young Min's surgical motion, a female doctor outside questioned him about whether he had been possessed by Young Min's ghost. Suk, however, disputed it, saying he had been concealing his surgical prowess for a long time. Young Min was keeping an eye on his body when he noticed that the drainage tube had been removed, as if someone intended him to be asleep indefinitely. To rejoin the tube, Young Min's soul tried to enter the body of another doctor, but he was unsuccessful. He was surprisingly visible and audible to the neighboring cleaning lady. Young Min was shocked when she greeted him and helped him reattach the tube right away. Following her, Young Min learned that the cleaning lady was also possessed by a ghost, Uncle Tae, who had long been a ghost. The laws were given to Young Min by Uncle Tae, who was well-versed in the spirit world. A soul can't be more than 100 meters from its body, and if you enter too many other individuals, you might never be able to return to your own body. Young Min had been watching himself ever since. Except for intern Suk, who paid him a visit every day, no one came to see him because of his harsh and disagreeable demeanor. In order to keep Young Min from bothering him, Suk feigned not to see Young Min's ghost. Young Min tried to follow Suk, but was abruptly stopped by an imperceptible wall that prevented him from doing so. Uncle Tae clarified that a soul could only leave its body 100 meters at most, and that it would require a companion to carry the body if it wished to travel beyond. Young Min was about to give up as he stared blankly at his body when the chairman's soul appeared to him. The chairman informed Young Min that in order to save him, he had to be revived. To find out why, Young Min hurried to the room where the chairman was sleeping, but he ran into Se-jin at the door. Se-jin was denied entry by her brother's security when she attempted to visit her father. Her brother wanted their father dead, so he could inherit the estate. Thus, he didn't want Se-jin to save him. Se-jin fled without being able to see her father, waiting outside and crying because there was nothing she could do. Young Min felt horrible when he saw her crying. To see how the chairman was doing, he went inside Suk's body. In the meantime, a patient with serious abdominal injuries was brought in as an emergency case. Suk showed the proper therapy with a single, accurate motion after inserting his hand into the patient's stomach right away. He then approached Uncle Tae to inquire about releasing his spirit from Suk's body. Young Min learned how to extricate his spirit from Suk's body from Uncle Tae. Once more, Suk was unable to recall what had transpired. Suk was commended by a female coworker who said that the patient's life had been saved because of his recent diagnosis. She was baffled as to why Suk had suddenly developed such talent. Young Min visited the chairman, whose soul was sitting next to him, in the hospital room in the meantime. The ungrateful son came in at that point and cursed his father for being so stupid. He said their father would still be alive if he had listened to his daughter and not had the procedure. Both souls were horrified to learn that Jin Suk, the son, was the one who had injured the chairman. Then he walked upstairs to see the director of the hospital. In order to prevent Young Min from returning in time to save the chairman, he and the director had planned to inject medications to hurt him. They had also arranged for a delivery guy to injure Young Min. Meanwhile, the assassin of the president, Tae-hyun, took his colleagues to check on Young Min, who was unconscious. Young Min was moved into a separate room reserved for patients who had no possibility of recovery. These were the same patients that Young Min had previously turned away because they had no prospect of survival, Tae-hyun said. Ironically, Young Min was now lying in the middle of them. Young Min was stunned by these statements and became acutely aware of how awful it had been to leave his patients behind in the past. He was startled to see the spirits of these patients all around him, and they appeared to despise him. Young Min was deeply sorry that she had previously refused to treat them. Young Min couldn't help but use Suk's body to confidently teach the more experienced surgeons whenever he saw a patient who was gravely hurt and in need of immediate surgery. Many trainees looked up to Suk as a hero after each successful surgery. Suk had been feeling strange about himself ever then. After looking over the security cameras, he saw what was going on and used his power to request that all of the film be removed. Suk took a day off from work to stay home and play games since he was tired of having his spirit invaded so often. But that day, a significant event occurred in the hospital. The remains of Young Min were relocated. Doctors were huddled around Young Min's body when he rushed back to the hospital room. In an attempt to re-enter his soul into Suk's body, he searched feverishly but was unable to locate him. Tae-hyun met with the director at this point and requested that Young Min remain, but he was reprimanded without warning. The director reminded Tae-hyun that he was the one who poisoned the chairman to enable the chairman's son inherit the fortune, and that he was the one who injured Young Min in order to obtain a professorship. Still anxious, Young Min frantically searched everywhere for Si-tak. When the dean brought a bed cart, he was taken aback. Si-tak subtly moved Young Min's body away at this point. When the dean attempted to follow them, the cleaning lady intervened and shoved him into the elevator. For a while, Si-tak was able to relocate the bed, but the director eventually caught him. Se-jin, unsure of how to explain, showed up right on schedule. She forbade Young Min from being touched. Director Han accused his mother, claiming that the hospital had been in disarray since his younger brother Si-tak started working. His mother, however, gave Director Han the order to help his younger brother. Se-jin later lamented leaving Young Min in the past while sitting by his bed. It dawned on Young Min that she still loved him. He followed her, but he was depressed when he was finally halted at the 100-meter line. Young Min borrowed Suk's body to go after his ex-lover when Suk passed by at that same moment. He got into a car and drove away, unable to get in touch with her. Young Min spent the entire day that day driving around in Suk's form till dusk. Unfortunately, his soul was expelled from Suk's body when he unintentionally ran into a woman while out on the street. He would die and his soul would disappear if he were to move more than 100 meters from his body. Young Min pleaded with Suk to save him right away, but Suk was preoccupied with the fainted woman, who appeared to be suffering from a serious disease. Young Min was aware that he was dying and that his hands were starting to deteriorate. In order to save the patient, Suk abruptly ordered Young Min to enter his body. Then Seon-tak extended his hand to Young Min. Seon-tak's soul entered his body when Young Min swiftly touched his palm. Young Min saved his soul because of this. Young Min sterilized the surgical instruments by controlling Seon-tak's body after they had fused. After then, blood from the nerve tumor leaked into the middle of the road, but Young Min, who was in charge of Seon-tak's body, managed to save the patient's life just in time. After then, the woman was brought to the emergency room. Tae-hyun was astounded by Seon-tak's ability to manage such a complicated circumstance, particularly in the absence of the necessary medical supplies. Seon-tak gained the admiration of an increasing number of colleagues. The hospital's lack of qualified physicians caused procedures for critical patients to be postponed while Young Min was in a coma. A youngster with a history of serious underlying illnesses was one of the cases, which made other doctors reluctant to do surgery. Young Min had previously rejected the boy's hand and refused to perform surgery on him. Now that she was looking back, Young Min regretted it even more. Even though it was extremely dangerous to repeatedly possess someone else's body, Young Min had been more proactive since then in putting his soul into Seon-tak's body to assist with many major emergency instances. Uncle Tae became worried about Young Min's soul after noticing this. Young Min saved a lot of lives that day, and those who had previously hated him suddenly started to respect him. But he was unable to locate his body when he went back to his hospital room. As it turned out, Se-jin had relocated him to the VIP room with the intention of taking care of Young Min and her father going forward. Regretfully, the cunning director also developed feelings for Se-jin and tried to manipulate her. Though unable to stop him, Young Min thought he was disrespectful. One day, Se-jin came across a newspaper article announcing her father's recovery. In actuality, Jin Suk had purposefully propagated this myth in order to affect stock prices. When Se-jin hurried to see her father, her brother stopped her from getting in. The chairman was still in a coma, Young Min found out. After their father passed away, Jin Suk declared that he would sell the stock when it peaked and then repurchase it at a reduced price. In order to find out the truth, Young Min followed Tae-hyun, who turned out to be the crooked son of the chairman and the director's accomplice. In exchange for a potential promotion to professor, the director had assigned Tae-hyun to watch over the chairman and remove his breathing tube if needed. The reality infuriated Young Min, who followed and made an unsuccessful attempt to combat Tae-hyun. Young Min expressed regret to the chairman and pledged to assist him in dealing with his unappreciative son. Young Min faced Tae-hyun that evening after entering Seon-tak's body and disclosing all of his secrets. If Tae-hyun cherished his life, he cautioned him from doing any more immoral things. Terrified, Tae-hyun followed Seon-tak and demanded to know how he found out about these secrets. But Seon-tak was confused and didn't realize what was going on. When Tae-hyun attempted to review the videos, he discovered nothing because Jin Suk, fearing exposure, rushed to the control room and ordered the removal of any damning evidence. Se-jin was worried about Young Min's deteriorating mental state back in the hospital room. Uncle Tae had once told Young Min that if he took on other people's bodies for an extended period of time, his soul might become trapped and he would always be a ghost. Fearful of the outcome, Young Min hurried out of Seon-tak's body. Fearing for his life, he watched his ex-girlfriend sob. San assured her that she would be with him forever if he recovered. Young Min was moved and determined never to own a person's body again. The other ghosts were startled when a dark soul suddenly materialized in the hospital. This was the delivery man's soul. A really serious case later came to the hospital. Young Min realized that a serious heart attack was what was happening. Professor Tae Hyun refused therapy because of this challenging case. Tae Hyun recommended that Seon Tak handle the procedure. Seon Tak was nervous and unsure of how to do the procedure, but he grudgingly agreed after being moved by the patient's distraught wife and kids. He then gave the order to have the patient taken immediately to the operating room. In actuality, Young Min's soul could have entered Seon Tak's body, but he was unable to do so because of a promise he had just made to Se-jin. Seon Tak was forced to do the surgery himself as a result. The director and the doctor arrived to watch the surgery as it started. At first, Seon Tak was confused, unsure of what to do, and even awkward with the scalpel. After a time, he abruptly turned to Young Min and begged him to enter his body in order to save the patient. Realizing that Seon Tak had always seen him but had acted as though he hadn't, Young Min was taken aback. This revelation overwhelmed Little Min, who discovered that Seon Tak had had the ability to see ghosts since he was a little child. He had even, fearlessly, assisted a ghost mother in getting her shoe back then. Young Min broke his word and entered Seon Tak's body after witnessing his earnest request. Seon Tak carried out the procedure right away with amazing assurance and deft hand movements. Everyone was amazed by how well the procedure went. Seon Tak then acknowledged in a private discussion that he was able to see not just Young Min, but all of the other spirits. Since Seon Tak had disregarded him for so long, Young Min felt duped and had repeatedly entered his body without realizing it. The two got into a heated argument, both claiming triumph and loss. Following the dispute, they made the decision to give up the body incarnation game. Everyone has been curious about how trainee Seon Tak could be so proficient since the amazing procedure. The director even asked to watch the video of the surgery. Seon Tak was suddenly approached by reporters the following day. It turned out that Director Han had written an online article praising Seon Tak's remarkable surgical abilities. It seemed to Director Han that his younger brother had simply been fortunate. He intended to place Seon Tak in a difficult situation where he would be heavily criticized if he was unable to manage a difficult case in the future. Because the two had been vying for inheritance, Seon Tak had a profound hatred for his brother. Since the breakup between Seon Tak and Young Min, Seon Tak has struggled independently and has become awkward during procedures. He even did not properly remove a drain. Young Min observed but declined to assist. Seon Tak became enraged and chose to open the window and toss Young Min's favorite vest outdoors as payback. Their hate for one another grew after Seon Tak dropped the vest onto the street in spite of Young Min's cries for help. The delivery man's black spirit, which had caused Young Min's accident, became stronger at this point and began to follow Young Min more closely, although she was still oblivious to his presence. Se-jin attempted to feed her father every day, even things he was allergic to, but the bodyguards consistently responded that he had consumed everything. Se-jin became suspicious as soon as she discovered her father had never really woken up. Fearing that Se-jin would be in more danger if she looked into it further, her father's soul came and looked for Young Min's soul. Young Min was asked by the chairman to look after Se-jin, his youngest daughter. Tae Hyun came in at that point and gave the chairman a poison injection to keep him unconscious. The chairman wanted Young Min to keep his daughter safe because he knew his son had a big plan. Se-jin got to the medical hospital just in time to see that the delivery man's body was seriously hurt. The spirit of the delivery guy materialized, pleading with Young Min to save him and admitting that he had set up Young Min's mishap for financial gain. He had no idea that what he was doing would put his life in danger. He knelt down and begged Young Min's pardon. Answers to Young Min's inquiries came gradually. He also heard Director Han and Se-jin talking, and he discovered that Director Han had used Se-jin's phone to send the message that enticed Young Min to the scene on the day of the accident. Young Min had to look into it and clear his identity as a result. In the meantime, a boy who was very sick pleaded with Seon Tak to do surgery. Despite his heartbreak, Seon Tak was unable to manage this challenging case on his own. Only Young Min could. Seon Tak was even more devastated as the youngster rushed to embrace his mother while sobbing. In an effort to assist, he located Young Min and proposed that Seon Tak assist Young Min in learning the truth about his accident while Young Min's soul enter his body to do the surgery. They made up right away, and decided to cooperate. He was being reprimanded by his wife when an emergency patient arrived. As it happened, the man had fallen after going to the mountains to have an affair. Young Min was about to leave after seeing this problematic case, but Seon Tak made the decision to intervene. He proceeded to save the man after allowing Young Min's spirit to enter his body, only to be hurt when the man's wife angrily grabbed his hair. The staff escorted the wife out so that Young Min, in Seon Tak's body, could execute the surgery when the patient quickly lost consciousness and required emergency treatment. The patient was effectively treated by Young Min, who was incredibly skillful. The patient was brought to the recovery room following the procedure, but the lover's husband showed up with plans for retaliation. Young Min acted swiftly and left Seon Tak's body, leaving him to be battered and face the repercussions. Seon Tak became enraged with Young Min once more after the incident. The director observed the scene, which was recorded by a security camera, without their knowledge. He gave the security officer instructions to send him Seon Tak's daily videos. A girl outside the hospital was crying vehemently at this point, begging for her brother's hospital fee to be lowered. She was the sister of the delivery man, and she put in endless hours to pay for his medical bills. Young Min had the chance to reveal the director's scheme because the delivery man had pledged to testify about Young Min's accident if he recovered consciousness. But the director flirted with Se-jin before Young Min could do anything. He had been enamored with Se-jin for years after witnessing her eat a grain of rice that she had taken from her hair. He brought food that afternoon in an attempt to impress her, but he threw away his lunchbox in exasperation when he noticed that she was leaning her head against Young Min. He thought he might have Se-jin now that he had put Young Min into a coma. At the same time, the director deceived Tae-hyun into going so he could take his position and give the chairman medicine to keep him unconscious. He pretended to have no idea, which diverted the attention of the two bodyguards and made it possible for Se-jin to enter the hospital room covertly. Se-jin went to her father after the guard had left, devastated to see him lying on the bed, gaunt and still. She was now positive that her brother was the cause of her father's illness. Se-jin surprised the two bodyguards by leaving the room a few moments later. She cautioned them to remain silent and give her access the next time if they didn't want to lose their jobs. The delivery man's involvement in Young Min's accident was subsequently disclosed to Se-jin by Seon Tak. Se-jin made the decision to treat the delivery man herself because she was determined to help. The youngster who had a bad ailment was also supposed to have surgery on that day. Young Min followed Seon Tak as he led the boy inside the surgery room, but a barrier suddenly stopped Young Min's progress. Unsure of what to do, Seon Tak noticed that Young Min's body was being removed for a scan as the surgery got underway. Because of this, Young Min's spirit was able to travel farther than the required 100 meters to get to the operating room. Seon Tak was designated as Tae-hyun's assistant, and he was nervous since Young Min's soul was no longer in his body. Tae-hyun was to oversee the procedure. He was sent out to be cleaned before he could return because he clumsily dropped the electric knife and unintentionally touched the ground with his hand. Young Min immediately turned to Uncle Tae's soul, who was housed in the cleaning lady's image, for assistance in this dire circumstance. Uncle Tae consented to help and went to get Young Min's body from the imaging room. Young Min was allowed to approach the surgical room as a result. Seon Tak was awkward and frequently reprimanded on this side. Young Min's soul started to infiltrate Seon Tak's body at a pivotal point. Seon Tak transformed right away, executing deft maneuvers that left Tae-hyun perplexed. He was unable to even follow the fundamental procedures. After cautioning him that Tae-hyun's professor chair would be in jeopardy if something happened to the patient, Seon Tak asked Tae-hyun to move aside so he could perform the treatment. Tae-hyun gave up his seat to Seon Tak after becoming alarmed upon hearing this. Although artificial heart replacement is a very unusual and challenging procedure, Young Min was very skilled and had previously completed it. Seon Tak's performance stunned the dean. Young Min and Seon Tak chuckled together as though they had won the jackpot following the procedure. But a foreign coworker broke the startling news to San. San was devastated when the professor read Young Min's test results, which showed that he had just a month to live. Young Min remained up that night, anticipating the baby's awakening. A rare emotional moment for someone as proud as Young Min was when the infant opened its eyes and sobbed with joy. Tak was not aware that Young Min had prepared a report on the boy's surgery in the interim. He hurried to his room as soon as he learned, intending to remove the report from his computer. Tae-hyun had printed it out beforehand, which was unexpected. When Tae-hyun saw that Tak's report was exactly the same as Young Min's earlier one, he became concerned and began to question whether Tak was actually haunted by Young Min's spirit. Tak chastised Young Min's spirit out of fear of being seen. His mother entered while he was disputing with Young Min and became alarmed when she unintentionally caught him talking to himself. Young Min's mother thought he was ill since he had been talking to spirits since he was a toddler. Se-jin, meantime, was taking out a pediatric patient's drainage tube. Because they had heard of Se-jin's talent, curious bystanders gathered. Unexpectedly, the youngster asked Young Min why he had entered Tak's body after opening his eyes and seeing his soul. Everyone was disappointed when Young Min was startled and unintentionally dropped the drainage tube. San saw that the delivery man was still unconscious on the other side. The cleaning lady yelled because the garbage can lid didn't fit when she checked on him, perplexed by his state. Se-jin got an idea when she checked it for dings. As expected, she discovered a blockage when she took off the bandage covering the delivery man's head. Soon after, Tak found out that Young Min had surreptitiously used his body to operate on a singer's heart. Tak understood that Young Min might not be able to regain his own body if he kept using his. Tak was furious and reprimanded Young Min. The singer's second heart transplant was about to happen. No one else had been able to do her previous heart surgery, so Young Min had done it herself. The singer had been transferred to the anesthesia room on the day of the procedure, and Young Min was ready. However, Se-jin abruptly vanished that day, so Tae-hyun had to take over the procedure. Since this patient had her heart valve replaced 10 years prior, the second replacement was far more complicated, and Young Min stood close by, extremely worried. Tae-hyun's unintentional rupture of the coronary artery caused the patient's blood pressure to drop, just as he had feared. Young Min watched nervously till Tak arrived, but she was powerless. Tae-hyun's error was expertly fixed by Young Min's soul entering Tak's body, resulting in a successful surgery. Tak told Young Min that he wanted to terminate their contract after he left the operating room. Since he knew that if Young Min's soul ever entered Tak's body again, he would actually die, he would no longer permit it to do so. Tak's mother started going through the recordings of her son and requested that the staff remove them all. Director Han unexpectedly put everything onto a USB with the intention of using it to take the inheritance. Because he didn't want Young Min to pass away, Tak made the decision to terminate their contract today. At that moment, however, a patient with an abdominal aortic rupture showed up at the hospital. The hospital intended to move the patient somewhere else because there were no doctors available who were qualified to execute the surgery. Tak abruptly stopped the hospital bed with his hand, much like Young Min had done when he saved a patient just like this 10 years prior. Young Min and Tak shared the same idea at that very moment, to operate and assist this patient in spite of the repercussions. Young Min wanted to make the most of his remaining time to save people because he knew he would eventually die. Following the patient's successful operation, Se-jin declared that the delivery person had also come too. Young Min anticipated the delivery person would clear Young Min's name and expose Director Han's wrongdoing, but to her surprise, the delivery guy couldn't recall the previous incidents. Young Min was incensed as he saw Director Han, who appeared to have bought the delivery man's silence by paying all of his hospital bills. They tried to save him, but the delivery man was unable to remember anything. Uncle Tae's ghost then materialized and clarified that waking people are unable to recall the experiences of their souls. Young Min ceased pointing the finger at the delivery person after realizing this. The delivery man was then reminded by Tak that he had been recruited by Director Han to stab Young Min on the day of the accident. The delivery man was startled and frightened. In the meantime, Young Min's spirit conversed with Tak's father's soul, requesting that he assist in punishing his unappreciative son. When reporters showed up the following day to speak with the son, they discovered that an internet photo of his unconscious father had been uploaded. As anticipated, this strategy brought the scandal to light. Everyone hurried to the president's hospital room, where Tae-hyun and the hospital director were waiting. Se-jin summoned the keeper of the will, her father's attorney, who started reading it. At the same time, a do not resuscitate order was issued, which meant that the president's will would take effect if his heart stopped beating. The president would lose everything if he died, which was why the son had kept him in a coma. Sean-tak's mother criticized director Han harshly following the controversy. He was forced to blame Tae-hyun because he had no other option. Knowing that it might be his final game, San personally took her father for lung and heart exams while his soul remained to play with Uncle Tae's spirit. When Se-jin checked her father's vitals, she discovered that his heart and lungs had ceased working. Even though she didn't want to, she was forced to follow the do not resuscitate order since she was so distraught. After removing the breathing tube with tears in her eyes and announcing her father's death, his soul disappeared. The soul of Young Min returned to visit Seon-tak on the day of the funeral. Given his limited time, Young Min made the decision to collaborate with Seon-tak on all outstanding cases. This was easily authorized by the hospital board, and for several days the two of them worked non-stop. Though Seon-tak grew fatigued, Young Min's soul remained full of energy, unmoved by fatigue. They both eagerly hurried to assist whenever an emergency patient arrived. In the meantime, Tae-hyun used the report that Seon-tak had previously sent to Director Han, which Tae-hyun was positive was written by Young Min, to plot Young Min's destruction. Tae-hyun attested to the fact that Young Min's ghost had taken over Director Han's younger brother. Director Han initially didn't believe it, but he hurried home after learning that his grandfather was going to the hospital. Unexpectedly, Director Han was reprimanded by his grandfather for overworking Seon-tak as soon as he met him. He questioned why they hadn't found a suitable physician to take Professor Young Min's place, given that he was in a coma and the hospital didn't have a qualified surgeon. Employees expressed concern as well and urged Director Han to step down immediately if it was not possible. When Young Min visited Se-jin that evening, she was in tears. Young Min could not bear to see her in such misery because her father had recently died. He pondered whether he was simply waiting for her to pronounce him dead while he lay there in a stupor. He was deeply saddened to see her crying and regretted not being able to console her. Young Min's soul instantly joined Seon-tak's body and moved to Se-jin's side as soon as Seon-tak entered the room. Young Min wrapped a blanket around Se-jin and caressed her cheek tenderly with Seon-tak's hand. While partially sleeping, Se-jin wondered whether Young Min was actually present in her dream. She sat up abruptly, and they embraced. Unexpectedly, Young Min's body's brain activity was triggered by that joyful emotion. Young Min told Seon-tak that he might soon get the chance to wake up, which excited him. Se-jin became concerned of how Seon-tak could have known that Young Min had displayed brain activity, so Seon-tak rushed to ask her. He had to make up a story about having a dream about it. Young Min, who asked Seon-tak to remind Se-jin to eat, loved life even more every day since she might wake up. Se-jin was perplexed by Seon-tak's unexpected interest in her. Last night, she could clearly recall hearing Young Min sing, but as she opened her eyes, she realized it was Seon-tak. It still seemed like she was touching Young Min when she gave him a hug. Additionally, Se-jin recalled that Seon-tak had oddly brushed her hair. Director Han, meanwhile, started to suspect that Young Min's soul was possessing his younger sibling. He frequently surreptitiously watched his brother do surgery and saw that Young Min's deft methods were similar to his own. His hunch that Seon-tak was in fact possessed by Young Min's spirit was further supported when he witnessed his younger brother moving Young Min's corpse one day. In another instance, a female ghost who enjoyed reading was assisted by Young Min's soul. In her chamber, her body remained in a stupor. After looking through her medical records, Seon-tak discovered that she had struck her head on a table from sleep deprivation and had gone into a coma. What was preventing her from waking up, though, was unclear. Young Min found out that her nose had bled when she collapsed after asking her soul directly about the event. After hearing this from Seon-tak, Se-jin became acutely aware that the illness was Takayasu syndrome and that the fall had resulted in an infection of the central nervous system. Se-jin pondered more how Seon-tak could have known such a secret. She concluded that the patient could have a chance to regain consciousness with brain surgery, but the treating physician was hesitant because it was a risky treatment. Se-jin persuaded the doctor to continue with tenacity. The girl's spirit was overjoyed to hear this information, but director Han used a ruse at a crucial point to reveal the reality of Young Min's ghost inhabiting Si-Tak. With Tae Hyun as his assistant, he set up Si-Tak to operate on a ruptured heart valve before coming to see firsthand to make sure Si-Tak was actually possessed by Professor Young Min prior to surgery. Young Min rotated his wrist as usual. His procedures, particularly his practice of suturing with his left hand, were extremely skillful. Tae Hyun acknowledged that there were no distinctions between Young Min's surgical techniques and his own. Director Han, looking on from the outside, was equally taken aback. He brought in Se-jin to divert attention just to be sure. Unconsciously, Si-Tak revealed who he was when Tae Hyun asked a question that only Young Min would know the answer to. It was too late for Young Min to know he had been set up. They now understood that Si-Tak's body had been inhabited by Young Min's soul. Young Min openly acknowledged that Professor Young Min's soul was controlling Si-Tak's body, knowing he couldn't keep this a secret from Director Han. However, Young Min's money printing machine wasn't Director Han. Since he was aware of all Director Han's secrets involving the tycoon's kid, he instructed Director Han to wait obediently for Young Min to awaken and to refrain from hurting him. Young Min, under the guise of Si-Tak, was able to depart slowly as Director Han was unable to speak. Following that discussion, Director Han started to have nightmares about ghosts. He was so terrified that Young Min could be listening that he dared not even speak aloud. Si-Tak was also informed by Young Min that Director Han was well informed. Si-Tak revealed that he had previously been in an accident that almost killed him, and that ever then, he had developed the ability to see ghosts. He had attempted to flee from them as a child because he was afraid of them, but it helped that he pretended not to notice them. But when he was doing surgery, he was terrified when he saw the souls of his patients. He frequently stopped practicing surgery because of this, and he has always hoped that Young Min will wake up soon. Unfortunately, Director Han overheard their talk. Director Han later crept in with the intention of removing Young Min's breathing tube when Si-Tak was out of the room and occupied with a phone call. He believed that if Young Min passed away, everything would be over and he would no longer be threatened. But in the end, he decided against it out of fear that he would lose his money printing machine. Director Han asked Si-Tak why he assisted spirits when he confronted him at home that evening. Without providing many details, Si-Tak offered to pardon Director Han and proposed working with him if he was prepared to change his ways. Director Han unexpectedly retaliated by threatening Si-Tak, asking, "What if Young Min dies?" Si-Tak hurried to the hospital the following morning to see how Young Min was doing, but fortunately, she was unharmed. She was the primary physician who performed the surgery on Se-jin that day. The patient required more care even after the successful surgery. The patient would have an opportunity to regain consciousness once the brain infection had fully cured. Si-Tak carefully urged his coworkers to keep an eye on Young Min's physique since he knew that happiness would help him wake up more quickly. In order to join Se-jin at the concert, he purchased a ticket for her and let Young Min's soul enter his body. Thus, Se-jin and Young Min attended the concert that day in the guise of Si-Tak. Memories of their time as students suddenly came flooding back as they sat side by side. Even though their situation was difficult at the time, they had always been there for one another. Curious, Se-jin inquired as to why Si-Tak decided to become a surgeon after quitting the theater. He retorted that he had once made a promise to a female who worked as a neurologist. Se-jin froze for a second, wondering how Si-Tak could have known, because this reaction was exactly like the promise she had given to Young Min. Si-Tak had faced numerous difficulties in his life ever since Young Min's soul had entered his body. After undergoing surgery, the soul of a young patient abruptly left his body to find Professor Young Min. A female nurse was tending to the boy's physical body, which was unconscious on the floor. The nurse wondered if Professor Young Min's ghost was close by when Si-Tak ran over. They were shocked by this inquiry because they didn't think she would be aware of Professor Young Min and Si-Tak's soul possession. The nurse saw that only Professor Young Min would warm his hands before operation, so she made a confident bet even though she couldn't see the ghost. When the two went back to see how the youngster was doing, they found that he needed more surgery to realign the artificial valve. Since Si-Tak was only an intern and lacked the authorization to oversee the surgery, He asked other professors to perform it. To his surprise, they all declined, even for other surgeries, and Sean-tak's name was deleted from the AIP. Director Han planned all of these activities. Sean-tak was furious, yet powerless to stop it. This youngster was included in the charity fund that Young Min had first established to assist pay for hospital bills for heart procedures he oversaw. The department chief stated that the boy would not awaken if surgery was not performed on him immediately. Seon-tak approached Director Han and asked him to operate on the youngster, but Director Han took advantage of the circumstance to exact revenge. The money was moved straight to Director Han's personal fund, and all of the patients in Young Min's care were required to halt their medical exams. The department head was taken aback. How could someone exchange a patient's life for cash? The boy's spirit, meantime, longed to embrace his mother but was unable to do so. He broke down in sobs upon seeing his own body on the bed. Unable to take it any longer, Seon-tak made the decision to stage a scene with the dean and other academics in order to fool Director Han. Everyone changed their work schedules, anticipating the day the boy would undergo surgery, so that Seon-tak would be the only one without a schedule. As a result, Seon-tak was permitted to help in the operating room. In an attempt to ascertain whether Young Min or Seon-tak was in charge, Director Han observed from outside. Unexpectedly, Seon-tak's hand continued to shake throughout the procedure. It appeared that the soul-body connection was shaky, which made the procedure exceedingly risky. Director Han, who was watching from outside, and the dean both became anxious. The instability continued, making the procedure extremely challenging to perform, despite Young Min's best efforts to concentrate on his pledge to assist the boy in returning to his mother. Young Min hurried away from the surgery after asking Uncle Taith why the soul-body link was so problematic that day, but Uncle Taith was unable to explain. It was even weirder that Seon-tak, who had previously recalled nothing when Young Min's soul entered him, now remembered portions of the surgery. The boy hurried straight to see Young Min as his soul was about to awaken. The lad inquired as to whether Young Min would awaken if he assisted him. Young Min felt as though this question broke his heart. He wanted to, but was unable to. The boy's soul abruptly vanished as the uncle and nephew embraced. The boy had woken up when Young Min hurried to the hospital room, but all he could see and do was touch Seon-tak. Young Min was devastated when Seon-tak cruelly ridiculed him. Young Min yelled angrily since, as a vegetable, nothing he did was important and only Seon-tak could really experience it. Young Min was devastated when he went back to his room and discovered Se-jin dozing next to his body, another image that depressed him. Like a child, Young Min started crying as she questioned why he had to bring suffering for everyone. He chastised his body, urging it to awaken, and inquired as to how long he planned to torture everyone while lying there. Seon-tak, who was also devastated for Young Min, heard everything from outside. The following day, Se-jin's brother unexpectedly made a comeback to the hospital and hurried directly into Young Min's room to face her. Standing close by, Young Min's soul heard the startling news that Se-jin had been coerced by her brother to travel to America years prior, threatening to have Young Min's arm broken if she didn't. To warn Young Min, he had employed thugs who threatened to permanently harm his hand, rendering him unable of using it. He had returned to cause further difficulty by attempting to get his sister to sign a document that denied her father's inheritance. Young Min stared helplessly as Se-jin battled her evil sibling. Fortunately, Seon-tak got there right on schedule. Seon-tak caught hold of Jin-suk's collar and punched him in the face after Young Min's spirit entered his body. The hospital director then showed in, so they withdrew to the room to talk about their plans in privacy. Director Han, however, no longer wanted to be associated with Se-jin's brother and sought to leave the scheme. Jin-suk threatened to reveal the hospital's role in Young Min's tragedy as soon as he saw this. Director Han was frightened after hearing this. When Young Min's soul entered Seon-tak's body, Uncle Taith realized the cause of the problems. Young Min's physical body was starting to heal, which caused his spirit to periodically oscillate back to it. Now, both people's spirits might be disturbed if they kept letting souls into their bodies. As a result, the procedures had to be temporarily delayed, and Young Min was compelled to cease merging with Seon-tak. Tak immersed himself into his studies, working day and night because he felt that if he couldn't serve patients, his mission as a doctor would be lost. Director Han met Han at this point and proposed a strategy to deal with young Min, akin to what had been done with a patient who had just recovered but passed away unexpectedly the next day. Tak, in the meantime, went to Se-jin and told her everything, stating that young Min had been invading his body and causing the familiar behaviors she had observed in him. Seeing this, young Min immediately yelled at Tak to stop, threatening to invade his body if he didn't. Se-jin was left in the room, utterly bewildered, as Tak had to depart. After a lengthy argument outside, young Min turned to find Se-jin sprawled on the ground. He hastily carried Tak to the emergency room using her body. Se-jin had actually fallen from exhaustion and sleep deprivation. Director Han gave Han the order to kill young Min that day, and Han returned to the hospital at the same moment. When Han entered young Min's room, he discovered that Tak had hired bodyguards, which stopped him from intervening. After entering Tak's body, young Min's soul prepared meals that Se-jin enjoyed and then accompanied her shopping for clothing. Se-jin couldn't contain her emotions as she sensed young Min's proximity to her once more. Tak returned home the following day to assist his mother in keeping an eye on the plumbing crew. By mistake, he sprayed water everywhere when he picked up a faucet. Tak discovered that young Min's coma was caused by constricted blood flow to his brain after having an epiphany and racing to the hospital. Young Min's corpse was sent for a CT scan right away, and it was determined that an artery was being crushed. Se-jin was ecstatic as he gave Tak a hug, and young Min rushed within him to share in the excitement. After that, Tak summoned a faculty meeting to present his findings. The academics were impressed by his assured explanation of every aspect. The department director suggested scheduling the procedure right away. While the department head was the lead surgeon, Tak asked to help as an assistant. Young Min's procedure was set for the next morning. Uncle Taith had urged young Min not to enter another body again, though, and his soul had also been disturbed during his adventure with Se-jin, which made him anxious. This may be quite harmful if it occurred during brain surgery. Young Min made the decision to educate Tak everything in order to get him ready for any eventuality. Director Han found out that Tak will be helping with the procedure in the interim. He remembered that young Min had been having problems with her body and had immediately come up with a sinister scheme. There were no other surgeons on duty when a patient with an aortic rupture arrived, producing uncontrollable bleeding. Despite young Min's stern warning that being possessed at this time was perilous and that any issue during surgery could result in the patient's death, Tak felt he couldn't refuse the urgent surgery. Tak, however, persisted in his resolve and carried out the procedure. When the patient's blood pressure continued to decline in the operating room, Tak felt confused and disoriented. Young Min's soul was quite nervous outside. Tak turned to the window for comfort, but young Min decided to take a chance and go inside Tak's body to finish the surgery when the machine indicated that the patient was going to die. The patient appeared to be saved, and the procedure was incredibly well executed. But surprisingly, young Min's soul was forced out of Tak's body as the procedure was coming to a close. Tak was unsure of his next course of action. Young Min rushed to re-enter Tak's body, but he was unable to do so. Uncle Taith rushed in and yelled at Tak to carry on with the procedure at that crucial moment. However, the patient's heartbeat had already stopped, thus it was too late. The soul of the sick stood and gazed at them. Tak had just lost a life, and he was stunned. He couldn't take it any longer and fled. Director Han called the director of the department to look into the failure of the procedure. However, the department head stated that since the patient's aorta had previously ruptured, this was not a medical occurrence. Director Han was furious that Tak had tried to save the patient by doing the procedure, but he was helpless and was shielded by everyone. Tak was so startled by the occurrence that he stopped communicating with everyone. Concerned for him, his mother looked everywhere. When Director Han noticed this, he said right away that it was because she had made him become a doctor. He advised her to let Tak to return home if she truly loved him. After then, Director Han and the others spoke on how to murder young Min. In order to make Young Min's surgery appear to be an accident, he gave Tahan instructions to have Young Min pass away before being brought into the operating room. He would have Hyun fill in for Si-tak because he wasn't present. In addition, they made wine to commemorate Young Min's passing. But the soul of Young Min was close by and heard everything. Now, finding Si-tak and getting back was the top priority. The nurse visited and met with Si-tak at his home. He asked her to submit his resignation letter, which he had unexpectedly previously prepared. Young Min's soul, nevertheless, persisted. He pleaded with Uncle Taith for assistance since he was convinced that his ghost was the one that had taken him 12 years prior. Uncle Taith came up with a scheme to get Si-tak back, but his mother had now consented to let him resign from his position. Mother and daughter have long-distance trip plans. Se-jin had to depart immediately because she had received a call at this point. The nurse unexpectedly called from a nearby location to alert Se-jin about Young Min's danger. When Se-jin came back, he discovered that his bed had been lowered, which allowed water to return inside and cause pneumonia. Si-tak was informed of this by a colleague, and he promptly canceled his return flight. But when he got back to the hospital, he discovered that this was Young Min's ruse to persuade Si-tak to come back, which infuriated Si-tak. Si-tak got a text message back home informing him that Young Min's surgery had been put off indefinitely. Suddenly, Si-tak was depressed. He remembered how Young Min had been able to enter the body of any patient and save them. Many patients would not be saved if they lost someone with his level of expertise. Colleagues unexpectedly informed Si-tak the following day that Young Min needed to be sent to a different hospital. Si-tak intended to head back to the hospital as soon as he heard this, but a baby passed out next to him. When the dean showed up, she inquired about the baby's health from the mother. Someone rushed to acquire first aid supplies, and all of a sudden, Uncle Taith's soul entered their body. When he returned, Uncle Taith gave the baby first aid by channeling his soul into the department head. The boy was spared just in time, thanks to a few little tricks. Uncle Taith was also a very good doctor, it turned out. Si-tak hurried in to prevent Se-jin from relocating Young Min after the matter was settled. He committed to fighting with Young Min till the end. Si-tak took everything he owned to the hospital the following day and remained there. To be sure nothing untoward would happen, he employed additional bodyguards to watch over Young Min's hospital room. He then talked about surgery every day while following Young Min's soul. Si-tak desired to save patients with his own hands. Si-tak practiced stitching a basic incision on the head pillow day and night as the first stage. He then studied tracheal tube insertion techniques. Observing Si-tak's awkward behavior, Young Min helplessly declared that the patient would perish if he did this. Si-tak was so focused on honing his dexterity that he practiced picking up each grain of rice throughout his lunch break. He gradually practiced using balloons to suture blood arteries. Si-tak was first awkward, which infuriated Young Min. But he persisted, and eventually he was successful. He then practiced on the heart model. He was so exhausted from staying up all night that he dozed off on the table. Unfortunately, a string of traffic incidents caused the hospital to unexpectedly receive a large number of emergency cases. The most serious patient was one of them. This matter was bravely taken up by Si-tak. He was being led by Young Min, who stood by him. Si-tak gradually began using his actual strength for the first time. He was the one who stitched the patient's wound. At first, everything proceeded without a hitch, but now someone was having a heart attack. Despite their best efforts, the on-call doctors were unsuccessful. Si-tak froze when the victim's spirit materialized. The patient's soul was on the verge of vanishing, and the physicians had officially given up. But this time, Young Min advised Si-tak to put forth more effort. With all of his remaining optimism, he leaped upon the table and excitedly pressed the victim's chest. Devoted to saving the patient, Si-tak's face was filled with emotion as he gazed at the ghost. Everyone around him was taken aback by this. The victim's soul swiftly vanished, but this man displayed life once more. A sigh of relief left Si-tak's throat. Se-jin started to have misgivings as he watched everything from the sidelines. She recalled that Tahan had claimed that Young Min's spirit had invaded Si-tak's body, and she frequently got the impression that she was Young Min while she was with him. Tak might have been possessed by Young Min's soul. Se-jin made the decision to confirm this for herself. She went right away to inquire about the food that Tak didn't enjoy from the nurse. Then she purposefully invited him to dinner. Tak ate surprisingly well. Se-jin became convinced that Young Min was the person standing in front of her as a result. "From now on, I'll invite him out to eat every day," she stated with joy. Unexpectedly, tragedy occurred as the two of them were strolling along the street. Because he believed Se-jin was seeing Tak, the older brother, who was constantly observing the two of them, arrived to stir trouble. His soul was forced out of Tak's body when he ordered his juniors to attack Young Min in secret. Tak had fainted, as Se-jin discovered when he ran over. Young Min has a frail and close soul. Young Min's soul started to fade because he had no body to return to. Se-jin abruptly called out Young Min's name at this point. She was aware of every secret that existed between him and Tak. Se-jin promptly dispatched an ambulance by calling the nurse. When Uncle Taith came, he noticed that Young Min's soul was on the verge of vanishing. He swiftly took control of an employee in that dangerous situation, then lifted up Tak's body and set it down to allow Young Min's soul to enter. Young Min's soul was spared as a result. Young Min discovered that Se-jin already knew everything when he got inside the car. She gave Tak a joyful glance. Se-jin grinned joyfully every day after that. Every day, Young Min came to ask Tak to tell Se-jin what he had to say. He even ate lunch with Se-jin every day by using Tak's body as a loan. When Tak's lovers realized that, they grew envious. To force Young Min's soul out, the girls purposefully gave him a harsh slap. Over Tak's body, the two girls began to fight. They made the decision to get together and talk about it after realizing something was amiss. They decided that they would alternate in their love for Tak. On rare occasions, Young Min could use Tak's body to date Se-jin, but only for a maximum of 2 hours at a time. After retrieving Young Min's body for testing, Se-jin found that his white blood cell count had grown, just as everything appeared to be going according to plan. Se-jin stated that the severity of pneumonia was increasing due to the rapid development of drug-resistant germs. There was no more time to wait. Tak called a meeting of the medical council right away. Because infection was involved in addition to surgery, the disease was far more serious this time. The patient would die if they made even one error. It would be totally resolved if thoracic surgery were done, but it will fail 99% of the time. Tak will need to wear a neck tube for the remainder of his life, despite the fact that opening the neck area is safe. The tube can clog at any time, and daily tasks will be extremely difficult. Tak went about having a private conversation with Young Min's spirit. They were aware that they could save Tak's life with neck surgery, but Young Min eventually lost the capacity to save lives as well. Tak therefore made the decision that he needed to get the best physician to assist Young Min in undergoing thoracic surgery, even if he had to scour the entire planet. He contacted all of the top academics, but since Young Min is a well-known physician, none was willing to treat him. They would have a permanent reputation if something went wrong. Young Min asked Tak to meet Tahan because he didn't have a doctor to assist him with the surgery. Young Min took a chance by asking Tahan to join the surgical team, despite knowing that Tahan had attempted to kill him multiple times. Additionally, Dr. Eun realized that the individual before him was Young Min's spirit entering Tahan. Tahan went straight to Director Han to request that he operate on Young Min. As promised, he intended to use that chance to kill Young Min. This was gladly accepted by Director Han, and Young Min's procedure was carried out right away. Director Han arrived to observe, along with the top physicians and the director of the department. The procedure was under Tahan's supervision. After giving Director Han a nod, Tak, an assistant, came into the room. The procedure was ready to start when the two nodded. However, everyone outside was taken aback when Tak and Tahan abruptly switched places. As usual, the soul of Young Min invaded Tak's body. Prior to operation, he rotated his wrist, and Young Min revealed that the procedure would now involve thoracic surgery instead of the initially intended neck surgery. Tahan had already visited Young Min's office. It turned out, Tahan sobbed because he felt horrible about the things he had done. Young Min trusted him, because of this. Together, they deceived director Han into allowing them to operate on Young Min. Simultaneously, the most challenging surgery in medical history occurred. The soul of Young Min operated on himself. But because of the incident where Young Min's spirit entered Sian Tak, things did not go as planned. Blood spattered from his shaking hands and feet. Outside, people were likewise very concerned. To fight back, Sian Tak must have a lot of courage. Every surgical incision was made with accuracy and rhythm, quickly fixing mistakes. Young Min attempted the surgery despite his body becoming increasingly lightheaded. Young Min's spirit was abruptly taken from Sian Tak's body just as the crucial portion was being sewed. Young Min was no longer strong enough to transfer his soul into Sian Tak's body. The rest was intended to be done by Ta Han, but Young Min asked Sian Tak to finish it instead. Since this was Young Min's body, Sian Tak felt a lot of pressure even though he wanted to utilize his own body to help him get over his anxiety. Beside him, Young Min continually urged Sian Tak to relax and gave him advice on everything. Young Min's soul progressively dwindled as a result of Sian Tak's meticulous and excellent execution of everything. The surgical wound healed, and Young Min's soul returned to his body. All signs were stable, the doctor declared. Director Han was the lone doctor who wasn't happy. Following the procedure, the department had informed Ta Han that although Young Min had repeatedly suggested him for the professorship, Director Han had disapproved of his application on the grounds that he discriminated against him for attending an unreputable university. Ta Han was reprimanded by Director Han for not executing Young Min. Ta Han stated that he wished to make amends for his transgressions and to never again lead such a wicked life. While checking his phone that evening, Sian Tak came across a video. Young Min's soul had entered his body at that point and was recording it. Young Min feared that he would lose all of the wonderful memories of his time as a soul when he woke up, particularly the fact that he had once borrowed Sian Tak's body. Everything is described in detail in the video, including the 3 months when Young Min was the soul. Sian Tak hurried over to express his happiness as Young Min woke up at the same moment. Young Min remembered nothing at all, as was to be anticipated. Sian Tak was ruthlessly driven off. Young Min forgot that he and Jean had reconciled until Jean brought him flowers. Because Jean had previously deserted him, he viciously pursued her away. When Sian Tak heard that, he became depressed. She left with a heavy heart. Young Min declined to accept Sian Tak's assistance in changing the bandage because they had previously harbored animosity toward one another. Director Han arrived a bit later to ask questions. He was ecstatic to see that Young Min had forgotten everything. Young Min abruptly declared his happiness. Young Min listed all of Director Han's transgressions and asked, "Why didn't you bring out the bottle of wine from the previous day to celebrate?" Young Min didn't forget anything, it turns out. When Director Han heard that, he was terrified and very anxious as he considered how to kill Young Min. Suddenly, the police called and asked Director Han to help with the inquiry. As it happened, Ta Han had turned himself in and produced all the proof that the patient had been injured by Director Han and Jean Suk. Ta Han was very calm because he had finished his atonement. For his offenses, Sian Tak's brother was also taken into custody. Young Min was able to walk with the tubes the next day. He had never seen such lovely sunlight before. They got into another argument because Sian Tak, who was being romantic, showed there to stir trouble. All of her father's possessions were inherited by Sian Tak. She moved into Young Min's home and gave everything to charity. They gave each other an extremely joyful hug. Young Min started working right away the following day. Sian Tak always accompanied him as he attempted to heal the most challenging patients. Everyone's health is precious, so don't wait until you lose it to appreciate it. The film concludes with this line: "I would appreciate it if you could subscribe to my support channel. Farewell, and see you later."